Okay.
Marvelous. All right. If you can recognize this wonderful night shot from the air, that is Egypt. Anyone ever been there? Just curious. Yes, we have a raised hand. Cool. All right. For those of you who haven't, you have something wonderful in store in your lives. So I hope that you can get there. You're looking at the Nile flowing from south to north and then branching out into the Delta and the Mediterranean. By day, it looks a little bit clearer like this. So it starts down here in the Sudan, doesn't start in the Sudan, starts much further south, comes up into Egypt, takes a nice little bend there. And then where we're going is right here at the apex of the Nile Delta. That's where modern Cairo is. And a few miles to the west of modern Cairo is my favorite site in the world, other than Back Bay and this area where I happen to live right down the street. So this is the Giza pyramids, and most of my focus is on this era of ancient Egyptian civilization. So think about 2500 BCE or so, almost 5,000 years ago, probably the most famous archaeological site in the world, and just an amazing place to be. We have 3 royal pyramids of pharaohs in order: Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. So they were built Great Pyramid, second and third. And then you might see all these little boxes surrounding them. Those are hundreds and hundreds of tombs of the elites, the high officials of the era. And each one of these is called a mastaba, which is just an Arabic word for bench because they look like benches. So I love this place, and I tend to think of Egyptology and archaeology at this area in 3 different ways. We might think of golden ages, and this is golden age number 1, the ancient time period. So when the pyramids were pristine and beautiful, you can see them with their wonderful white limestone casing stones that were still intact. These must have been gleaming and blinding for miles around when they were done. Did you know that these outer blocks were quarried away in the Middle Ages to build medieval Cairo? So that's why you see the stepped appearance and the much more yellowish appearance of the limestone today. So that's golden age number 1, ancient Egyptian culture, the high point of the old kingdom, this very centralized state, very organized project management to be able to build something like the pyramids, which are nothing more than royal tombs of the reigning pharaohs. Golden age number 2, the era of the great excavations. So about 1900 to 1950. And you're looking at a shot of our very own expedition. So I hope you will take pride in something called the Harvard University Boston Museum of Fine Arts Expedition. And here they are clearing multi-ton blocks away from a particular temple near the 3rd pyramid. Golden age number 3, right now. So you are living in a wonderful time period where we can use all kinds of new archaeological sciences, 3D modeling, all kinds of data retrieval, experimental, immersive, virtual reality, augmented reality, lots of ways to put these on top of the original expeditions and reinterpret, ask new research questions, and get new answers. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, is the way we're going at the Giza pyramids and learning new things about them. How did I get interested in this kind of thing? Well, careers take lots of twists and turns, and I know there will be many in your futures too. So I thought I'd just share for a moment how I came into this field, since not everyone ends up going into Egyptology, but it's a pretty small endeavor. So I grew up locally. I went to Belmont Hill School and then to Harvard as an undergraduate. And I got very interested in the Museum of Fine Arts Egyptian collection. And I wormed my way into a summer volunteer position there. And before I knew it, they took me out to Giza, I think my senior year in high school. And from there, I worked at other expeditions as well. That's me trying to play the guitar after an exhausting day in the desert around 1978, I think. After college, I had a fellowship to go to Germany and study Egyptology over there, which was a wonderful, eye-opening experience. I encourage all of you, anytime you can do a semester abroad, a year abroad, it just shows you how other people live, introduces you to other cultures, other ways of thinking. So I highly recommend it. From there, I came back and did my graduate work at the University of Chicago. They have something called the Oriental Institute, and it was very famed for Egyptology. So it was a privilege to do that, mainly because there was no Egyptology PhD in the Boston area. So I had to go there. And then they took me out to Egypt to work at another project called Chicago House, where we were making line drawings of beautiful temple walls and inscriptions for publication. And I worked at this place called Luxor Temple. That's not Giza, that's hundreds of miles up the Nile further south. And we lived in this glorious Spanish-style, California-like mansion and had research libraries and special offices and the whole bit. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life in Egypt until I was called back to the Museum of Fine Arts because a curator position opened up. And so I was delighted for the next 20, 25 years or so to be a curator at the MFA. work with the collections, and be able to go back to Giza as well. And I started teaching at Tufts University and brought a lot of the Tufts students over to the MFA to work behind the scenes on some of the Giza work that we were doing. So that was a great source of Army labor, and I think they enjoyed it too. And then finally, Harvard got its act together and created an Egyptology professorship. And I was very lucky to get that in 2010. So I've been at Harvard since then. I jumped across the river. So on marathon day, I don't get the day off. I have to work because I'm in Cambridge. I'm not in Boston anymore. So that's the price you pay for changing jobs. But I was very lucky to have that job, and honored too, because the last time there was Egyptology at Harvard was about 86 years ago with only one predecessor. And this is the guy. And I've been studying him ever since. George Andrew Reisner, who looks a little bit like Teddy Roosevelt, doesn't he? But you know, you can't have a Roosevelt bobblehead without getting a real one. So I created a Reisner bobblehead too, because I thought we needed to do some competition. So he grew up in Indianapolis. He came to Harvard, class of 1889. Won't bore you with all the biographical details, but he's the reason we have such a great Egyptian collection and Sudanese or Nubian collection at the MFA today. He was one of the founding fathers of archaeological method. And in 1905, he organized this joint expedition between Harvard University and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And they wrote a contract, spelled it all out, and it was mainly to be a one-year dig. And it lasted about 43 years. He spent pretty much the rest of his life in Egypt and the Sudan, only came back here to teach about 3 or 4 semesters. Did you know that Copley Square was the site of the original Museum of Fine Arts? There it is. It's been replaced by a hotel. So one of the wonderful things about this research is that it's all around you. I live just down the street. The MFA was in Copley Square. Reisner came for his 50th anniversary of his Harvard degree and stayed on Beacon Street over there, if I'm oriented correctly. MFA directors lived in this area. It's just amazing. So anywhere you go, there's eventually a connection to the MFA or to Harvard or to the expedition. It's great stuff. By the time he was done, he had worked at all of these sites in red. So don't worry about all the names and things, but you can see it's about 23 different sites over 40 years, and not just in Egypt, but in the Sudan as well, what we call ancient Nubia. It was really an amazing achievement. And the finds that he came up with were just incredible. This is just a smattering of them from many, many different sites in Egypt and Nubia, or modern Sudan. And in those days, you did a 50-50 division with the authorities. They would keep half of the finds and half of them could come to the MFA. Or if you were in Egypt, it would go Cairo Museum and MFA. If you were in the Sudan, it would be Khartoum Museum and the MFA. So an amazing achievement. But even more than this is that he kept great track of the archaeological context. And by that, we mean where the things were found, what it looked like when they were found, what were they next to, keeping all kinds of photographs and drawings and diaries and maps and plans. That's what a modern expedition has to do. Then it's not just plunder and, you know, ripping out the gold and taking the statue without anyone ever knowing, how did you find it? Where did you find it? What does it all mean? So if you haven't been to the MFA, please get there. There are spectacular things. It's the greatest Old Kingdom Giza collection outside of Cairo, and much, much more. There's Nubian material as well. Unfortunately, a lot of it not on view because the museum is in transition with its galleries, but I hope that will change. Why work on this stuff? Why pay attention? I mean, it's been around for thousands of years, right? What's the rush? Well, I hope that this then and now comparison photo will answer that question for you. This is a 1927 photo of statues engaged or carved right into the wall of a non-royal tomb at Giza, and what it looks like today in the color photograph. You can see the faces have been hacked out, probably for sale at the art market. There's salt leaching to the surface and peeling away the decoration and destroying the hieroglyphs and things. So we have our work cut out for us in cultural heritage management, conservation, preservation, and of course, study this stuff before it disappears and can no longer tell its story. So God bless Reisner and the expedition for keeping such meticulous records. And we have now in Boston 45,000 glass plate negatives. In those days, no iPhones, right? They were plate photography on glass plates, sometimes almost as big as a regular sheet of paper. Imagine the information on these things and the fragility, getting them all the way from Egypt back home. Thousands of drawings, maps, plans, architectural renderings, notes, diary entries, log books, register numbering systems for the objects. It's just unbelievable. So we thought, how do we deal with all this? This is just an overwhelming mass of stuff. How do we make it intelligible and studyable? And so around 2000, when I was at the MFA, I got a lot of money from the Mellon Foundation in New York, And we thought we would attack Giza and try to intelligently link all this data together. How to do that? We came up with a database where we would take the private tomb, the individual tomb of just one Egyptian official, and make that the central node in the database, and say that, well, for that tomb 2010 or something, what do we have? Well, we've got 50 photos and 30 diary pages that mention that tomb, and 6 statues and 4 drawings and an unpublished manuscript over here and 3 articles in scholarly journals. Let's link them all intelligently in our database and then serve them up on a website. So that's the sort of underlying skeleton of our project for many, many years. It's to take a tomb, find out what's related to it, and link it intelligently. And then we realized, well, that's great to get all of the Reisner American expedition stuff for Giza, but what about all the other expeditions that worked at the site? It's no good to know everything about this tomb because it was dug by an American, and nothing about the tomb next door because the Germans dug it. So I went off to Europe and I signed up all the other museums and institutions that have Giza stuff, and they willingly shared up their photos and documentation. So all of that feeds into our website and project. Since we started, we've had about 1,000 people work on this, scanning photos, typing diaries, proofreading things, doing data entry. People just like yourselves, actually. Tufts undergraduates, Harvard undergraduates, Egyptology grad students, museum volunteers and docents, all levels of skills and interests. And it's been quite a ride. And then after assembling all this old archaeological data, that's now packed into our website, and you can go there. In recent years, we moved into 3D modeling and trying to give you other ways to get to Giza without buying a plane ticket, like this, where you can see an overview model of the site. And some of the tombs are now accessible this way. So you can click on a tomb and it takes you inside. And depending on what's in there and how well preserved it is, you can do things like this, like restore the ancient colors, wander around, click the little button in the lower right between the model and the photogrammetry. So now you can see what the actual tomb looks like today, jump back and forth between the Golden Age #1 and Golden Age #3, and get a real introduction to these monuments. Many of them are locked, they're closed to the public, so you can't even get in except virtually this way. So we're constantly experimenting with different ways to bring the site alive. And in the time I have left, I think I'll just show a few examples of that. Here is one near the very, very famous Sphinx. And you can see where the red arrow is pointing. There's a stela there. That's just a big chunk of stone with hieroglyphic inscriptions on it. The interesting thing here is that there's 1,000 years between the stela and the Sphinx. The Sphinx is 1,000 years older than that stela. So what's it doing there? The Sphinx is Dynasty 4, Old Kingdom. The stela is Dynasty 18, built by or installed by this guy, Thutmose IV. And in those days, the Sphinx was really quite buried up with sand because a lot of time had gone by. Here's a shot. You may recognize this former Minister of Antiquities, Zahi Hawass, my good friend, standing in front of the stela, and maybe you can make out some hieroglyphs there and see how big it is. Well, at my museum, not the Museum of Fine Arts now, but across the river at Harvard, at the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, we found a way to take plaster casts and make modern replicas of these monuments. And some of them are on display as teaching tools. And I thought, how do I bring this more alive? So you can actually do this over at the museum, or you can even do it at home. We created an app, which you can download for free from either the App Store or Google Play Store. And it does cool things. You can either go to the museum and aim your phone at this reproduction of the stela that you see, or at home, you can go on our virtual tour of the museum and navigate up to that gallery, have the stela on your laptop screen and aim your phone at your laptop. And it does cool things like tell the story of what happened. What happened was the young Prince Thutmose, 1,000 years after the Sphinx, is tooling around the pyramids, having a great time. And he takes a nap at midday and the sun's overhead. And the Sphinx appears to him in a dream and basically says, dude, I am covered in sand. If you will dig me out, I will make you Pharaoh. So we have this nice little animation that tells that story. I think maybe you could see the prince has fallen asleep. Now he's having his dream. And then the Sphinx is going to awaken and tell him, to dig him out, and he'll promise the throne. And basically, this is what Thutmose does. He excavates out the Sphinx and restores the area because it's 1,000 years old by now. And he becomes Pharaoh. And so he tells the story on this stela. Is it true? I have no idea. It's a great propaganda piece, though, isn't it? To justify how you made it onto the throne. So there's the king digging out the sand, etc. What else can you do? You can aim your phone at the stela and see a line-by-line translation. So you are now reading hieroglyphic inscriptions. This is all augmented reality. It's just projecting on your phone screen and using the stela like a QR code, right? But we don't have to bother with QR codes. Or you can go and stand between the legs of the Sphinx and look up at the area and circle around in 360 degrees. And the little time slider at the bottom lets you jump from various time periods, like the New Kingdom when the stela came, or the Old Kingdom when it was just the Sphinx, or the current state of what it looks like today, and circle around. So these are all ways to try to make the site more accessible, more exciting, and if you can't get there, to experience it in interesting ways too. And then I'll finish up with this one. This is one of my favorite projects. This is Harvard Camp. It's just a cluster of very simple buildings. There's the headquarters with a nice courtyard. And George Reisner lived here most of his life. This was home. He didn't own any property back here. When he came to teach, he sometimes lived at the Harvard Club over there. Yeah, I think over there. And or on Brattle Street, he'd rent an apartment or something like that. But this was the central headquarters. All the objects came through here. And it's right behind the pyramids. Imagine having a little veranda right here and settling down with a cup of tea in the afternoon and watch the sun go down and the pyramids turn golden orange in the sunlight there. It's a great place to live. And no plumbing, no electricity, none of that. It was pretty simple. But this is where the books got written, the objects got studied and recorded and divided. And so I always thought this is a great way to teach the archaeological process. Here's the view of the courtyard. You could see it any day over 40 years. It was just loaded with potsherds and fragments of stone vessels and statues and all kinds of stuff. So we decided to model it and see what we could do with it. So here is Harvard Camp, a sort of fictional version with a lot of the great masterpieces all in the courtyard. We've already cheated, right? Because all those masterpieces were never there at the same time. One was found in 1913, one in 1925 and all of that, but you get the idea. So we model it. And then the next step is to put ourselves into the model, to go back in time. So what you're seeing here is an experiment at Harvard. And this little video will show you how it works. It's basically two screens, right angles, and then a floor, and we're projecting the model on it. And then I go into the model, and on the screen, it looks like I'm actually there. So we can start teaching, not from the classroom, but from Harvard Camp, or from between the paws of the Sphinx, or anywhere you want to be. And you could beam someone else in for a conversation as well. As the camera circles around, you can see how the illusion is working here. So it all comes together quite nicely. I hope we can do more of this. It's Zoom 2.0, if you will. And I think it's more interesting than a talking head in a box most of the time. You've had plenty of that in the last few years, I'm sure. You can also project objects in front of me. So that table is not really there, for example. And I can take my iPad and beam in an object that is the subject of today's class. You know, if we're reading the hieroglyphs on that object, I can zoom in on it, or I can rotate it around a little bit. So there's some great possibilities once you've built all this kind of 3D modeling on the original excavations from the old days. So it's been a lot of fun. So I thought we'd take one object and kind of follow it through the archaeological process, what I call animating Harvard Camp. This is in 1936. Did it freeze on us? Let's see if I can get it going again. Let's try that again. 1936. This is a standing statue of a high official carved in limestone, and it was found in a pit in his tomb. And so what's the archaeological process? You're not looking at the real statue now. You're looking at a 3D model. The whole terrain is modeled. It's immersive virtual reality here. So first you find it. You have to photograph it in place. You write up your diary entry saying, we found this statue. It's got hieroglyphs on the base. It lists his name, which is Kui and Khufu. Then you gently lift it out after you've recorded its location. It comes to Harvard Camp. You hope the cat doesn't jump on top of it and make a mess, and you study it. And what happens next? It needs to get entered into the log book or the object register book. So you'll do that. You'll see if it needs any conservation work as well. Take care of that. There is the object register book. You can see down below, there's there it is on the left, a sketch is made and a description and the measurements. Where did it come from? We need to know the tomb and the tomb number. Then we bring it into the photo studio because it has to be documented. So we have the discovery photos of it lying down in the pit. Now we've got the beautiful studio shots of it in black and white, taken with this large format glass plate camera. Again, no iPhones back in 1936, no color photography really to speak of as well. And then comes the decision after conservation and study and numbering and diary entries and descriptions and all of that, where does it go? So the antiquities authorities come up to the pyramids, they look at what you found over the whole season and they say, very nice, we'll take this for the Cairo Museum, you can ship that one to Boston. And it turns out Kui and Khufu was allowed to come here, and there's the shipping crate. And if he's on view, I think he might have just got taken off view in all of the new galleries at the MFA. So you might not be able to see it live, but there he is, he's part of the collection. So a wonderful way to kind of follow one object through the archaeological process. And none of it would be possible without George Reisner's very careful recording systems, numbering systems, photography, documentation. So how do you do this stuff? Well, you play with 3D scanners like this, handheld devices, and you see it flashes light and builds a kind of a model. There you see it appearing in real time on the laptop right here. And then you've got a wonderful rotatable model. You can look at that on the Sketchfab website. Some of you probably played with that before. And of course, after that model, the next step is the cool part, 3D printing it. This one's really fun because this head is in Boston, but where's the rest of the body? It's in the Cairo Museum. So I thought I'd print this thing out and then take it to Cairo here and ask the authorities to let me have the original and try to put it on and see if it actually fits. And it really does. You can see the hieroglyphs on the back actually align beautifully. And I printed it in this garish bluish color because I didn't want anyone to think I was walking around Cairo with an antiquity under my arm and stop me at the airport coming out. So I left it there. I gave it to them and they've got it now. But another way that some of this technology can help put things back together. It's great fun. And then finally, just one example that isn't Egyptian, but it's in my museum. If you come in at Harvard and go to the top floor of Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, we have all of these Assyrian palace reliefs. These are from Mesopotamia, not from Egypt. And these are replica reproductions as well, like the dream stele of the Moses IV. And the goal here, again, is to come in, aim your phone at them. We're not quite there yet, but we've got some demos. Restore the colors. We've done a lot of hard study on what the ancient colors were. But let's take that one step further and try to bring the reliefs back to life and find out what's actually going on here. So we can do that too, whether it's a hunting scene where the king is shooting at lions, or musicians, or foreign tribute, foreigners bringing in all kinds of gifts for the king or something like that. So I hope that eventually you can come into that gallery and aim your phone anywhere and cool things will start happening. That is the goal of some of our projects. It's a lot of fun to work with this stuff and see what the new technology is. The big challenge is that here I am trying to create an archive forever using tools that, as you know, go out of style every 6 months. There's a new version, spend this money, get rid of that format, convert it to this. And it's almost impossible to keep up, but we do the best we can. I hope you'll do the best you can as well and explore different approaches, different technologies that can help whatever you're excited about and take it a little bit further. And I'm happy to answer any questions, and thanks for joining this morning.
Questions? Yeah.
I was wondering how you do color reconstruction.
How do you do color reconstructions? Great question. Sometimes you have a tomb that's got no color at all or no decoration. There's nothing you can do. You're stuck. If you have a tomb that's got some paint left in it, then you have some hints. Plus, the Egyptians usually colored their hieroglyphs and their scenes the same way. So a wig will always be black. The mouth hieroglyph, which is the letter R, will always be red. And so if you've got traces in the tomb, that's a clue. And then the next clue is go to other tombs at other places from the same period that have colors preserved, and you've got a model to work from. So in the tomb I showed you, we were really lucky because those colors are still in the tomb today. So it was pretty easy to reconstruct. But yes, you have to be careful. It's a great question.
Thomas and then Ella.
I know you said that you went to the museum and you fell in love with it, but like, why specifically?
Yeah, great question. Some people choose archaeology because they love digging and they don't care where or what. And other people want to focus on a particular civilization or time period. I was in the second case. So I grew up locally. Ancient Egypt was 4th grade history class, and I never grew up. So just loved it. It was a great way to feel special, to chase something interesting. And then I think because we had these great collections at the MFA, that really hooked it for me. If I'd grown up in Nebraska without an Egyptian collection, maybe I'd be working in a bank today. I don't know, maybe a totally different career. Of course, in those days, there was no internet. So, I couldn't be surfing and learning about things remotely. So I was very lucky that that collection was there and that I was able to convince the curators to take me on. I went in one time and asked them if I could volunteer, and they said, great. And then about 2 days later, they called me back and said, wait a minute, what were we thinking? You're way too young. No, we can't do this. But, I took courses with them and they saw I wasn't a lunatic and all that. And the following year, they let me volunteer. So persistence pays off in the end.
Ella?
Feel about requests like companies who don't create artifacts, especially from our museum.
Yeah, great question. Do the objects in the MFA belong in the MFA? What about Nefertiti? What about the Elgin marbles? Should they all be repatriated? We talk about this a lot in class, and it's a great question. And I think we are now rethinking the ethics of a lot of these things. And in some cases, things should go back. What I try to tell the students, though, is there isn't a black and white answer. It isn't everything should all go back to the original countries. In many cases, the original country was not that country back at that time. What do you do with the Ottoman Empire, for example? Things found in what is today Israel, should they all be sent to Istanbul because they were controlling the area at the time? So great questions. In the case of the Harvard MFA expedition, these were legal contracts. They were signed with the antiquities authorities. It was an official division of finds. So I would put them in a very different category from, say, the Elgin marbles that were essentially ripped out of Greece and are now in the British Museum. The bust of Nefertiti, legally excavated, legally sent to Berlin, but under suspicious circumstances. So that's a little bit murkier of a case. So I'd say in each example, you really need to look at the facts, the context. There's a huge difference between a statue that's been in some English country lord's house for 400 years and then gets sold at auction at Sotheby's versus a beautiful wall relief that was hacked out of the tomb wall yesterday and sold on the black market. Two different kinds of things. But thank you for the question. We got to keep going and explore that ethically.
Margaret Manuelian?
Sure. So where does all this information end up? Yeah, it's a great question. First, it goes to the scholars, right, who are really focused on detailed questions about the society and culture. And they publish articles in journals, and we write books about that. We go to conferences. We just had one in California last week, and we'll have a virtual version of that next week. That's step one. Then the important thing is to disseminate, to figure out what does it all mean for a wider audience and try to reach that wider audience, which means get rid of the jargon and the technical terms and make it intelligible. What is ancient Egypt contributing? How does it relate to the world today? What is Egypt in the popular consciousness? What is Hollywood and the movies and videos done to it? Is it accurate? Is it not? How does ancient Egypt measure up with ancient Israel or Mesopotamia or Philistines or Phoenicians or others? What are the contributions? What about imperialism? What about colonialism? Ancient colonialism? Modern colonialism? We have so much to learn from the past and so many mistakes that we can avoid. But I would say going back to ancient Egypt, a civilization that lasts 3,000 or 4,000 years, basically with the same state system intact, there's something you can learn from a culture that that stays afloat for that long, and it's worth exploring.
So I would say that we as a collective have very superficial you ask someone randomly on the street, like, what was ancient Egypt? They probably say something about the pyramids or something.
Yeah.
They wouldn't really know anything beyond that. So how do you feel about that fact that people maybe just have to we have no understanding of the culture?
Yeah, what a wonderful question. So it's true when you say ancient Egypt, and I usually start a lot of my classes this way, you came into the class because you thought hieroglyphs were cool. You've heard about King Tut, you love pyramids, you want to look at mummification, or maybe you've heard of Cleopatra. It's kind of the tip of the iceberg. And there's so much more. I mean, those are cool things. There's no doubt about it, but there's so much more. And that's what really gets fascinating. And to debunk some of the popular myths, like Hebrew slaves built the pyramids or aliens built the pyramids, which is really kind of a racist thing to say, right? The ancient Egyptians couldn't have been intelligent enough to build the pyramids themselves, so it must be aliens. It's our failing, the specialists, if we haven't gotten the word out and excited people about the real ancient Egypt, not the strange Hollywood movie ancient Egypt. So there is this dual responsibility, I think, in any field that you go in. Focus on what you want to do, go into the details here, but back up every once in a while. What's the bigger picture? How does this connect to the larger society? And how can I express myself and get that word out and tell people that, yes, what I'm doing is important and relevant and it fits into the bigger picture. We all have that duty, I think.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, are other people doing similar things in the classical world or other cultures? Absolutely. So it's really hard to keep up with all of the exciting new developments that are coming along, whether it's drone photography and digital elevation models and reconstructing ancient waterways from aerial photography, 3D modeling. LiDAR surveys are amazing in Mesoamerica, South America, where you can actually see through the ground cover, all of those trees that no one could ever notice before. And my God, there's whole Maya cities below that no one ever knew about. So great things are happening all over the place. And hopefully we can learn from each other as we break out of our silos, try not just to do Egypt or just to do Greece or just to do Inca civilization or something. And slowly we move the field forward together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great question. How have the policies changed? Basically, nothing leaves the country now. So in the old days, yes, it was a 50-50 split. And here's the tricky part about that. It wasn't the Egyptians themselves making that rule. Back then, from 1882 on, the British were running the government in Egypt and the French were running the Antiquities Service. So really that 50-50 split between Reisner and the Antiquities Authorities run by a Frenchman. So at what point do the Egyptians stand up and say, we weren't running our own country back then, so let's revisit some of those agreements. Nowadays, nothing basically leaves. So whatever you find is staying in Egypt. It's even somewhat over the top. It's difficult to take samples out, human remains or for mineralogical studies and things like that. Drone photography is still a problem to get permissions, but we're getting better. But in general, we work with the Egyptians who are now in charge of their own antiquities service, as they should be. And by and large, we all work very well together. There's, 40, 60 missions from all over the world working at any given time up and down the Nile. And the focus now is on information. It's not on finding gold. It's not on finding statues. It's not on enriching the whole museum gallery and collection. So those days are gone, I think, forever. They've definitely changed. And that's why universities have jumped in, where in the old days, museums were really funding the digs.
One more, Rihanna.
Why did Egypt like cats?
Why did Egypt like cats? Because I put it in the model, that's why. Who doesn't like cats? I have 5 of them down the street over there. So I'm out of control. I'm gonna need a kennel license pretty soon. Cats were just among the many animals that Egyptians, I won't say worshiped, because they're not wandering around worshiping bulls and ibis birds and baboons and things like that. These animals are representing various forces in nature, and they come to symbolize them. And that's how the Egyptians are weaving them into their religion. But there is a sort of cat goddess, or a goddess with a female body and a cat's head, who fills in various aspects of religion, protection and war and things like that. And so you'll see mummified cats and mummified crocodiles and mummified baboons and ibis birds. And as you get through the later periods of history, there's more and more animals that way. But you'll also see beautiful tomb paintings of the tomb owner and his wife sitting at a party, and there's a little kitten in their lap. And it's so cute. And it's a real direct connection to how I spend my day a lot of the time.
Let me just see if there's anyone on Zoom with a hand raised. Anyone in our library have a question? I cannot see a little orange hand. Anyone else? Yes, Thomas and then Adam, and then we'll perhaps liberate our wonderful speaker.
To go home to his cats.
Well, I've recently been enjoying Moonlight. I don't know if you've seen it. It's like a new one.
Yeah.
It's like about Egypt. A bit of a sillier question. What's your favorite job? And why?
Wow. What's my favorite god? I always thought Anubis was pretty cool. He's the jackal-headed god, and he kind of escorts you through the netherworld and helps you, get to a successful afterlife. And he just looks cool with his jackal face and human-headed body. Um, Great question. I'll have to think some more about that if there's any competition. Osiris isn't bad either because he helps you resurrect and have an eternal afterlife. Who doesn't want that, right? But I think Anubis is pretty cool. Got one more?
Yeah, Brianna, one more, or that was it?
Oh, no, I was just expressing my happiness.
I picked the right god. Awesome.
Adam, and then we'll wrap up.
I'm curious if in the last 30, 20 years, there's been one particular discovery that's revolutionized the area, one particular aspect of our understanding of the ancient Egyptian culture.
Yeah, any great discoveries in the last 20, 30 years? Lots of them. And if you go on the Ministry of Antiquities Instagram page or Facebook or whatever, you'll see there are press releases and announcements almost weekly for great discoveries. I'd say one of the great ones was 2013, where the oldest written papyri in the world were found on the Red Sea coast. And those papyri actually have kind of instruction manuals about building the Great Pyramid. We never expected to see something like this. It has the journal of a guy named Merer, and he talks about leading his crew and transporting blocks from the Red Sea, and then also a quarry south of Cairo, and how to get them to the Giza site and how many days it takes. It names locations, and so we can understand the harbors and the drop-off points a little bit better. It names a famous guy who's got a beautiful bust or statue in the MFA, so he's now famous again too. So this is huge. This has really revolutionized our understanding of not just how the Egyptians built the pyramids, but how the pyramids built Egypt, how they organized the social structure and the project management. This was really a state-run undertaking, not just at Giza, but all up and down the country. So that's a biggie. And then beautiful painted tombs and hundreds of mummies and all kinds of stuff still coming up all the time.
Close us out.
Yeah, I had a question about sort of the police work involved in sort of find artifacts that may have been stolen or raised, and then maybe there's some guesswork that's been involved in trying to figure out what they said. But we now have the technology you're talking about, able to link those to record sites and sort of like go back and sort of like tackle some documentation about it.
So when you find an object, can you now trace its origins more accurately? Yeah, I'd say so. We're understanding more about stone, for example, and trying to determine what quarry it came from. So where it was originally quarried and manufactured. If there are inscriptions and they name a temple or a site or a town, that helps us know, oh, that guy probably comes from this place and not from that place. Dating criteria too. We look at the style and say, oh, that has to be New Kingdom. It can't be Old Kingdom because look at that wig or look at that costume. So the more we learn about the culture, even the writing, the look of the hieroglyphs or the style of the signs can tip us off a little bit that way. So I'd say now, as opposed to 50 or 100 years ago, we can zoom in on what this piece is all about and try to reconstruct its past a lot more accurately. Yeah.
Well, I am full. Dreaming and knowledge and inspiration. Thank you so much, Professor Manuelian.
My pleasure.
Thank you all for your great questions.
From your questions, I can tell that the future is bright here and we're in good hands. So keep up the great work. Thanks.